Hello everyone and welcome back to our channel. Today we will be discussing 20th century novel previous year questions. If you are watching for any other university apart from Delhi University, this can benefit you as well since these are the important questions of very prominent authors. The answers will be on the screen for you to screenshot, so now let's get started. Question number 1. Comment on darkness as a symbol in Heart of Darkness. Darkness in Conrad's novella is never fixed. It keeps shifting between the literal, moral, psychological, and epistemological. Geographically, it starts as the unmapped Congo, but Conrad flips this early on when Marlowe calls London itself one of the dark places of the earth. Morally, darkness is what surfaces once civilization's restraints are removed, seen clearly in Kurtz. Psychologically, it stands for the unknowable core of a person, shown in Kurtz's dying words and Marlowe's own lie to his intended. And epistemologically, darkness reflects the limits of language itself. The story reaches us only through layers of retelling, so the heart is never directly seen. Question number 2. Discuss the character of Kurtz and his significance in the novella. Kurtz barely appears until two-thirds into the book, and even then only in fragments. He functions more as an idea than a fully realized character. He arrives as Europe's most gifted idealistic agent, but once free of social restraint, he sets himself up as a god, raiding for ivory and ending his humanitarian report with exterminate all the brutes. Conrad's point is that Kurtz isn't an aberration, he's imperialism's logic extreme. Marlowe calls him hollow at the core, meaning his brilliance had no moral center, so the wilderness simply filled the emptiness already there. His final words, the horror, are read by Marlowe as a moral victory, a rare act of self-judgment. Critics also read Kurtz as Marlowe's dark double, the man Marlowe could have become. Question number 3. Discuss the multi-layered significance of Marlowe's journey in the heart of darkness. The journey works on several levels at once. Literally, it's a commercial voyage up the Congo to retrieve Kurtz, and Conrad fills it with documentary detail. Wasted machinery, dying laborers, empty bureaucratic language. Mythically, it becomes a descent into the underworld, echoing Dante's Inferno. Psychologically, it's a test of Marlowe's own restraint, as he recognizes an unsettling kinship with what he sees as savage around him. And narratologically, the whole story is filtered through Marlowe's retelling to an unnamed frame narrator, which keeps the reader permanently at a distance from the truth. The novel opens and closes on the Thames, collapsing the distance between London and the Congo, implicating everyone, including the reader, in the same darkness. Question number 4. Write a short note on the title Heart of Darkness. The title works on at least 3 levels. First, geographically. Kurtz's inner station, the farthest and darkest point of the river. Second, morally, the capacity for cruelty and self-delusion hidden inside every civilized person, embodied mostly fully in Kurtz. Third, it points to the story's own elusive center. The narrative frame keeps the truth always out of reach, and even Kurtz's dying words remain ambiguous. Conrad never lets these 3 meanings collapse into one. The title is a truth that can only be approached, never fully processed. Question number 5. Heart of Darkness as a critique of imperialism. Discuss. Conrad exposes imperialism through unsparing detail. The groove of death, where African laborers are worked to collapse and abandoned, waste machinery, shells fired uselessly into an empty coast. He shows the gap between imperialism's civilizing rhetoric and its brutal practice. Most starkly, in Kurtz's own report, which begins with humanitarian idealism and ends in a genocidal scrawl, Kurtz represents imperialism taken to its logical extreme. Given power without oversight, the civilizing mission simply becomes naked violence. However, the novel has real limits. Most famously pointed out by Chinua Achebe, African characters remain largely voiceless and are used mainly as a backdrop for European moral drama. So the novel critiques imperial practice powerfully but doesn't fully escape the racial assumptions of its time. Question number 6. Why does Gertrude Morrell disapprove of William's fiancée? Are her feelings justified? Mrs. Morrell sees Lily as vain, shallow, and unworthy of William, more interested in appearances than his inner life. But Lawrence makes clear this judgment is tangled up with possessiveness. Mrs. Morrell's sons have become substitutes for the fulfillment she never found in her marriage. William is caught between his mother's disapproval and his own attachment to Lily, and this paralysis contributes to his early death. Her feelings are partly justified. Lily does prove shallow and unsupportive, but the novel also frames Mrs. Morrell's possessiveness itself as a destructive force. Question number 7. Describe the tumultuous relationship between Clara and Baxter Davis. Clara and Baxter's marriage collapses because Baxter wanted possession without real communion. while Clara felt reduced to a domestic role rather than treated as an equal. The separation leads Clara toward the suffragette movement and eventually towards an affair with Paul, while Baxter's humiliation turns into hostility, including a violent physical confrontation with Paul. Yet Lawrence resists easy villain victim framing. Once Baxter falls seriously ill with typhoid, Paul actually nurses him and encourages a reconciliation, and Clara returns to him. The reunion, chastened by suffering, becomes one of the novel's quietly hopeful thread about vulnerability enabling genuine intimacy. Question number 8. Discuss the significance of the title Sons and Lovers. Lawrence's original title was simply Paul Morrel, but the final title shifts focus from one individual to a repeating pattern. Sons who are emotionally required to be lovers to their mothers, and lovers who must impossibly compete with that maternal claim. Mrs. Morrel, disappointed in her marriage, redirects her emotional intensity into William and then Paul. Paul's failures with Miriam and Clara both trace back to this unresolved attachment. William's earlier compressed versions of the same crisis reinforces that this is a family pattern, not an individual quirk. Only after his mother's death does Paul move ambiguously toward the possibility of independent adult love. The title thus names a psychological structure, not just a plot. Question number 9. Sons and Lovers as a Bildungsroman. Discuss. The novel follows the classic coming of age arc. Paul's childhood, his job at Jordan's factory, his growth as a painter, and formative relationships with Miriam and Clara. But it complicates the genre by making the mother's claim on Paul an active obstacle to his growth rather than just a backdrop. So his development stalls rather than moving cleanly forward, like Joyce's portrait. It gives real weight to Paul's artistic formation, and where a typical Bildungsroman ends in clear resolution, this one ends ambiguously. Paul walking toward the quote unquote glowing town after his mother's death, his future deliberately left open. Lawrence uses the form to question whether full formation is even possible for someone so bound to a single relationship. Question number 10. Analyze the edible relationship between Paul and Mrs. Morrel. Mrs. Morrel, unhappy in her marriage, redirects her romantic energy onto her sons, and her bond with Paul is described in language borrowed from romantic love rather than ordinary affection. Shared walks, exclusion of the father, intense jealousy of Miriam and Clara. This attachment damages Paul's capacity for adult love. Guilt over his mother undermines his intimacy with Miriam, and even physical passions with Clara can't fully displace his mother's place in his inner life. Only his mother's death, hastened by a mercy overdose Paul and his sister administer, finally, partially frees him towards the independence. Question number 11. Compare Miriam and Clara as the two women in Paul Morrel's life. Miriam represents spiritual and intellectual communion, earnest, romantic, drawn to books and nature, but associating physical intimacy with something almost sacrilegious. Clara represents physical passion, worldly, sensuous, and the source of Paul's fullest sexual awakening. Yet both relationships ultimately fail for the same underlying reason. Paul approaches love as divided between soul and body instead of integrating both, and his unresolved attachment to his mother prevents full commitment to either woman. Question number 12. Write a short note on Sally Seton and her significance in Mrs. Dalloway. Sally exists mostly as a vivid memory from Clarissa's youth, rebellious, unconventional, and the source of what Clarissa recalls as the most exquisite moment of her life, a kiss between them. Sally represents a road not taken, an alternative erotic and emotional life apart from Clarissa's respectable marriage. When she reappears at the party as the conventional Lady Rossiter, the gap between memory and reality dramatizes the novel's larger theme of time's transformative power. Question number 13. How does Woolf portray Septimus's trauma, and what does this say about post-war attitude to mental health? Septimus, a war veteran haunted by the death of his officer Evans, experiences what we'd now call PTSD. His trauma isn't one violent memory but a numbed inability to grieve, which later erupts into hallucinations. Woolf renders his inner world with the same lyrical stream of consciousness authority she gives Clarissa, making his experience sympathetic rather than simply mad. Her sharpest critique targets the doctor's. Holmes dismisses his conditions entirely, while the fashionable Bradshaw diagnoses a lack of proportion and pushes institutional confinement disguised as care. Septimus's suicide becomes ambiguously a final act of autonomy against a society obsessed with conformity. And when news of it reaches Clarissa's party, she feels a strange kinship with him, showing how his story mirrors her own. Question number 14. Does Mrs. Dalloway probe and critique the politics of space? Yes, Woolf uses space to explore class, gender, and power throughout. London streets appear democratic on the surface, but Septimus and Regia experience the same space as alien and threatening, showing how public space is unevenly felt. Clarissa's small attic room symbolizes her limited, guarded independence within marriage, a modest version of the room of one's own, Woolf would write about later. Her party is itself a constructed space, Clarissa's own quiet art form of bringing isolated lives briefly together, and references to Richard's political career and Peter's year in India tie London's private drawing rooms to the widening machinery of the empire. Together, these layers show Woolf mapping the unequal distribution of freedom and voice through physical and domestic geography. Thank you very much. That's all the 14 questions for today. If this helped you, make sure to like, subscribe, and share our video with all of your friends. Thank you very much, and we will see you again in the next one.